My name is Elvira Roberts, but everyone calls me Ellie. I'm 68 years old, and last Thanksgiving, my daughter-in-law Allison Green made me sleep in the cold, damp basement of what she thought was her house while she and my son Tyler hosted their annual dinner party upstairs. She handed me a thin blanket, pointed to the concrete floor next to the water heater, and said with that perfectly practiced smile of hers, "Sorry, Ellie, but with all our guests staying over, we just don't have anywhere else to put you. You understand, right?"
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
What she didn't understand was that I didn't just own that house. I owned every single house on Willowbrook Lane, including the mansion she believed belonged to her. Growing up in the small mountain town of Cedar Falls during the 1950s, I learned early that the most powerful people often looked the most ordinary. My grandmother, Meredith Dale, was a quiet woman who wore the same 3 house dresses in rotation and clipped coupons from the Sunday paper with religious devotion. She lived in a modest 2-bedroom cottage on the outskirts of town, tended a small vegetable garden, and walked everywhere because she claimed cars were an unnecessary expense. The neighbors pitied her, thinking she was just another poor widow scraping by on a pension. What they didn't know was that Grandma Meredith had been quietly buying up properties throughout Cedar Falls for over 30 years. Every time someone fell behind on their mortgage, every time a family needed to sell quickly, every time a business owner wanted to retire, Grandma Meredith would appear with cash in hand and a fair offer. She never haggled, never took advantage, but she never missed an opportunity either. I was 16 when she finally showed me the metal box she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom closet. Inside were dozens of property deeds, stock certificates, and bank statements that revealed a portfolio worth more than the rest of the town combined. "Ellie," she said, adjusting her wire-rimmed spectacles as she spread the papers across her quilted bedspread, "money that makes noise attracts the wrong kind of attention. Real wealth whispers." She taught me that the loudest voices in any room usually had the least substance behind them, and that true security came from owning things people needed, homes, businesses, land, not from displaying things they merely wanted. By the time I turned 18, I understood that our family's modest lifestyle wasn't about poverty. It was about protection, privacy, and focusing on what actually mattered. When Grandma Meredith passed away during my sophomore year of college, she left me everything: 43 rental properties, 2 small apartment complexes, a controlling interest in the town's only bank, and enough cash to expand the portfolio significantly. She also left me a letter with 3 simple rules. Never let anyone know the full extent of what you own. Never use your wealth to buy people's love or respect, and never forget that your character matters more than your bank account. I followed those rules religiously when I met Thomas Roberts at a church picnic in 1978. He was a carpenter with calloused hands, laugh lines around his eyes, and a way of listening that made you feel like you were the most interesting person in the world. He never asked about my family's finances or seemed interested in anything beyond getting to know me as a person. We courted for 18 months, married in a simple ceremony at the community church, and moved into a comfortable but unremarkable house on Elm Street. Thomas knew I had inherited some properties from my grandmother, but I downplayed the extent considerably. I told him I had a few rental units that provided supplemental income, which was technically true, just dramatically understated. He was content with his carpentry business, proud of the beautiful furniture and cabinets he crafted, and never pushed me for details about my inheritance. He trusted me, and I protected that trust by keeping my business affairs quietly separate from our personal life. When our son Tyler was born in 1982, I was determined to raise him with the same values Grandma Meredith had instilled in me. We lived modestly, shopped at thrift stores, and taught Tyler the importance of hard work and humility. Thomas built custom furniture for wealthy clients, while I managed my properties through a discreet property management company, collecting rent and handling maintenance issues without tenants ever dealing with me directly. Tyler grew up believing his mother was a part-time bookkeeper who helped local businesses with their accounting. Another technical truth, since I did manage the finances for several of my commercial tenants. He was a good kid, respectful and hardworking, though perhaps a bit sheltered from the harsher realities of how money and power actually operated in the world.
Tyler excelled in school, played baseball through high school, and after graduation got a job at the county assessor's office, evaluating properties for tax purposes. It was steady, honest work that provided a decent living, and Thomas and I were proud of him for making his own way in the world. He moved into a small apartment downtown, lived within his means, and seemed content with his independent life. Everything changed when Tyler started dating Allison Green in the summer of 2019. She was 26, worked as a real estate agent, and came from what she repeatedly described as a successful family. Her father, Quentin Green, owned a regional chain of furniture stores, and her mother, Midge Green, was active in the country club social scene. Allison herself drove a white BMW that her parents had given her as a career starter gift, and she lived in a trendy loft apartment in the most expensive part of town. From the very beginning, Allison made it clear that she had specific expectations about lifestyle and social status. During family dinners, she would make subtle comments about our modest home, suggesting improvements that would really maximize the potential of the space. She frequently mentioned how different things were in her family's neighborhood, where people understood the importance of maintaining certain standards. At first, I attributed these comments to youthful enthusiasm and perhaps a bit of nervousness about fitting in with Tyler's family. But as their relationship progressed, it became clear that Allison viewed our modest circumstances not as a choice, but as a limitation that needed to be overcome. She began encouraging Tyler to pursue promotion opportunities more aggressively, to network with people who could really help his career, and to consider whether his current lifestyle was truly worthy of his potential. The first real warning sign came during Easter dinner in 2020, when Allison offered to bring dessert and arrived with an elaborate cake from the most expensive bakery in the county seat. As we gathered around our simple dining room table, she looked around and sighed dramatically. "This room has such potential, Ellie," she said with exaggerated sweetness. "Have you ever considered updating the decor? I know this amazing interior designer who could really transform this space and bring it into the 21st century." Thomas, bless his heart, didn't catch the insult embedded in her suggestion, but I certainly did. I smiled politely and replied, "We're quite comfortable with things as they are, dear." Allison nodded with patronizing enthusiasm. Of course. I just think it's important to invest in your environment, you know? It says so much about who you are and where you're going in life." The implication was crystal clear. Our environment suggested we were people of limited means and even more limited vision. As Tyler and Allison's relationship grew more serious throughout 2020, these small criticisms became more frequent and less subtle. She would comment on my vintage clothing choices, suggest that Thomas might benefit from expanding his carpentry business into more lucrative markets, and frequently mention how much more sophisticated things were in her parents' social circle. When Tyler announced their engagement in the spring of 2021, Allison immediately began planning a wedding that seemed far beyond what their combined salaries could reasonably afford. The wedding planning process revealed another troubling aspect of Allison's personality. She had very specific ideas about how everything should be done, and those ideas invariably involved spending enormous amounts of money.
When I quietly offered to help with some of the costs, she laughed dismissively and said, "Oh, that's sweet of you to offer, Ellie, but Daddy's already taking care of everything. We want this to be absolutely perfect." The message was unmistakable. Their definition of perfect was beyond anything Thomas and I could provide. The wedding itself was held at the prestigious Mountain View Country Club, where the Green family held membership. Everything was elaborate and expensive, from the imported orchids to the 9-course dinner with wine pairings. Thomas and I were seated at a table with some of Tyler's co-workers from the assessor's office, while the Green family and their friends occupied the prime tables near the head table.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
During the reception, Midge Green made a point of introducing us to other guests as Tyler's sweet parents, in a tone that suggested we were charming but ultimately inconsequential accessories to the main event. After the wedding, Tyler and Allison moved into a luxury apartment in Willowbrook Heights, the newest and most expensive development in Cedar Falls. The rent alone was more than Tyler's monthly salary, but Allison insisted they needed to live somewhere that reflected their potential and would provide proper networking opportunities with the right kind of people. It quickly became apparent that maintaining this lifestyle was creating significant financial stress for the newlyweds. The complaints began almost immediately. During family dinners, Allison would sigh dramatically about how expensive everything was, how impossible it was to save money while paying such high rent, and how frustrating it was to be stuck in an apartment when all her friends were buying houses. She never directly asked for financial assistance, but the hints were constant and increasingly less subtle. Thomas, who had always been generous with Tyler, began offering to help with various expenses, but I could see that Allison's expectations far exceeded what we could reasonably provide without revealing the true extent of our resources. The pressure intensified when Allison discovered that several houses in the exclusive Willowbrook Lane neighborhood were coming on the market. This was the most prestigious street in Cedar Falls, lined with beautiful colonial and Victorian homes that had been built by wealthy lumber barons in the early 1900s. I knew the area well. In fact, I had been quietly acquiring properties there for over 20 years, carefully maintaining them as rental units while preserving their historic character and charm. "We need to buy something before prices go up even more," Allison announced during a Sunday dinner at our house in the fall of 2021. She spread real estate listings across our kitchen table like battle plans. "There's this absolutely gorgeous Victorian on Willowbrook Lane that just came on the market. It's exactly what we need to establish ourselves in the community." The asking price was $450,000, which was well beyond what Tyler and Allison could afford on their salaries, even with the raises Tyler had received at the assessor's office. But Allison had apparently already worked out the finances in her mind. "Daddy's willing to co-sign the mortgage," she said matter-of-factly, "but we need about $80,000 for the down payment and closing costs." She looked expectantly at Thomas and me, clearly assuming we'd be thrilled to contribute to their dream home purchase. Thomas immediately began mentally calculating how we might be able to help, suggesting we could take out a loan against his workshop, or perhaps liquidate some investments. I watched him trying to figure out how to make the numbers work, his generous heart overriding his practical concerns about such a large financial commitment. But something about Allison's presumptuous tone bothered me deeply. She hadn't asked for help, she'd simply announced that help would be needed and expected us to figure out how to provide it. "That's quite a significant amount of money," I said carefully. "Have you considered looking at something more affordable to start with, building equity gradually?" Allison's expression immediately shifted from expectant to disappointed, and then to something approaching disdain. "Ellie," she said with exaggerated patience, "you can't build real wealth with a starter home mentality. This is an investment in our future. Tyler deserves better than settling for less." The implication was clear. Settling for less was what people like Thomas and I did, and she expected more from her husband's family. Tyler, caught between his wife's expectations and his parents' apparent reluctance to immediately provide $80,000, looked uncomfortable, but ultimately deferred to Allison. "It really is a great opportunity, Mom," he said quietly. "Houses in that neighborhood rarely come on the market, and the one Allison found has incredible potential." I knew this was true because I owned 3 properties on Willowbrook Lane, including the house directly across from the Victorian that Allison was so determined to purchase. In fact, I had been the landlord for the previous tenants of Allison's dream house until they'd moved out 6 months earlier. The property had been sitting empty while I decided whether to renovate it for higher-end tenants or sell it outright. Listening to Allison's grandiose plans for a house I actually owned was surreal, but I maintained my composed expression and simply said we'd need to think about such a major financial commitment. Over the next few weeks, the pressure from Allison intensified dramatically. She began showing up at our house with renovation plans, neighborhood market analysis reports, and detailed financial projections, showing how homeownership would benefit their long-term wealth-building strategy. She spoke with the confidence of someone who had never been told no, and her presentations were impressively polished and persuasive. Thomas was gradually wearing down under her persistent campaign, and I could see he was preparing to find a way to make the money available, regardless of the personal cost to our own financial security The breaking point came when Allison suggested that Thomas and I should consider downsizing our own home to help fund their purchase. "You two don't really need all this space anymore," she said, gesturing dismissively around our comfortable living room. "The equity you've built up over the years could really help Tyler get started in life the right way." She said it as if she were doing us a favor by suggesting we disrupt our entire lives to fund her lifestyle upgrade. That evening, after Allison and Tyler had gone home, Thomas and I had our first serious disagreement about money in over 40 years of marriage. He couldn't understand why I was hesitant to help our son achieve what seemed like a reasonable dream of home ownership, and I couldn't explain my reluctance without revealing that $80,000 was a relatively minor expense for us, not the major sacrifice he assumed it would be. "Ellie, he's our only child," Thomas said, pacing around our kitchen with uncharacteristic agitation. "If we can't help him when he needs it most, what's the point of all the work we've done over the years?" His frustration was genuine and heartbreaking. He had spent decades building his carpentry business, taking pride in every piece of furniture he crafted, believing that our modest lifestyle meant every dollar required careful consideration. The conversation ended with Thomas sleeping in his workshop and me lying awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering how much longer I could maintain the fiction of our modest circumstances. The weight of keeping such significant secrets from the man I loved was becoming unbearable, but I also knew that revealing the truth would fundamentally change our relationship and possibly our marriage. The next morning, I drove through the Willowbrook Lane neighborhood, past the houses I owned and the tenants I supported, thinking about Allison's assumptions and expectations. The Victorian house she wanted was indeed beautiful, a stunning 1890s home with original hardwood floors, intricate crown molding, and a wraparound porch that I had spent considerable money restoring to its original grandeur. It was worth every penny of the asking price, but her attitude toward my family and her barely concealed disdain for our lifestyle had crystallized something important in my mind. If Allison wanted to live in my neighborhood, she was going to learn what it meant to actually belong there. I called my property manager that afternoon and instructed him to list the Victorian house for sale. When Allison and Tyler called excitedly to tell us that their dream house had suddenly come on the market, I expressed appropriate surprise and enthusiasm. When they asked again about financial help, I told them Thomas and I had discussed it extensively and decided we could contribute $30,000 toward their down payment, enough to be helpful, but not enough to make the purchase easy. Allison's response was immediate and revealing. $30,000 wasn't enough, she said. They needed the full $80,000, or the deal wouldn't work. She couldn't understand why we weren't willing to invest more in Tyler's future, and she began suggesting increasingly dramatic ways we could raise additional funds. Perhaps we could refinance our house, or sell Thomas's expensive woodworking equipment, or ask my extended family for help. Each suggestion carried the implicit assumption that we owed them this opportunity and were being unreasonably stingy by not providing it. When I gently suggested that they might need to look at less expensive options, Allison's mask of politeness finally slipped completely. "I don't understand you, Ellie," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Tyler is your only child. Don't you want him to have nice things? Don't you want him to succeed in life?" The subtext was unmistakable. If we truly loved Tyler, we'd find a way to give Allison exactly what she wanted. That conversation convinced me that Allison's vision of success was entirely material, and that her love for Tyler was conditional on his ability to provide the lifestyle she felt she deserved. More troubling was the realization that Tyler was beginning to adopt her perspective, viewing his parents' reluctance to fund their dreams as evidence that we didn't believe in his potential or care about his happiness. 3 weeks later, Allison called with exciting news. Her father had agreed to provide the additional $50,000 they needed, making their offer competitive and enabling them to proceed with the purchase. She was triumphant and more than a little smug, having proved that someone in the family was willing to prioritize Tyler's success over their own financial comfort. The closing was scheduled for mid-November, and Allison immediately began making plans for their new life in the prestigious neighborhood. She hired an interior designer before they even owned the house, started researching landscaping companies, and began talking about the dinner parties she planned to host for Tyler's colleagues and her real estate clients. I congratulated them warmly and offered to help with the moving process, an offer that Allison graciously accepted while making it clear that she had very specific ideas about how things should be done. She had already hired professional movers for the furniture and valuable items, but she thought it would be sweet if Thomas and I could handle some of the smaller boxes and cleaning supplies. It was, she explained with condescending kindness, a way for us to feel involved in their exciting transition to homeownership. The implication that we should be grateful for the opportunity to provide manual labor was insulting, but I smiled and agreed, already planning how this arrangement would serve my own purposes.
Moving day arrived with Allison in full command mode, directing traffic with a color-coded schedule and treating the entire process like a military operation. She had prepared detailed instructions for every aspect of the move, from which rooms should be unpacked first to where each piece of furniture should be placed. Thomas and I dutifully carried boxes and cleaning supplies, receiving corrections and suggestions from Allison as she supervised our contributions to her grand vision. The house itself was even more beautiful than I remembered from my last inspection 8 months earlier. Allison walked through each room like a queen surveying her new domain, pointing out architectural features and discussing her renovation plans with anyone who would listen. She was particularly excited about the master bedroom suite, which had a walk-in closet and marble bathroom that she declared perfect for entertaining important guests. As the afternoon wore on, Allison's comments became increasingly pointed about the differences between their new lifestyle and the one Tyler had grown up with. She made several remarks about how wonderful it would be to finally have space for proper dinner parties, to live somewhere that reflected their values and ambitions, and to be part of a community where people understood the importance of maintaining certain standards. Each comment was ostensibly about their new house, but the implications about our family's shortcomings were unmistakable. The final straw came during the housewarming party Allison organized 3 weeks after moving in. She had invited Tyler's colleagues from the assessor's office, her clients and fellow real estate agents, and several neighbors from Willowbrook Lane. Thomas and I were invited, but it was clear we were expected to play the role of proud but humble parents, grateful to see our son doing so well for himself in such an impressive home. The party was elegant and meticulously executed, with catered horse hors d'oeuvres, professional floral arrangements throughout the house, and a bartender mixing cocktails in the renovated kitchen. Allison played the perfect hostess, gliding between rooms in a designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, introducing guests to the home's architectural features and highlighting the renovations that made their new house so special. When people asked about the house's history, Allison mentioned that it had been just a rental property, but had been beautifully maintained and was now finally getting the attention it deserved from owners who truly appreciated its potential. The dismissive way she said just a rental property made my blood pressure rise, but I maintained my composure and continued smiling politely at the other guests. At one point during the evening, I overheard Allison talking to Margaret Hines, an elderly neighbor who lived 2 houses down. "Thank goodness the renters are gone," Allison said, with a laugh that sounded like crystal breaking. "You know how tenants can be. They never really take care of a place the way owners do. There's just no pride in temporary living situations." Margaret nodded sympathetically and mentioned that she hoped the neighborhood wouldn't become too transient, with rental properties potentially bringing down property values and community standards.
"Oh, that won't be a problem here," Allison replied with absolute confidence. "This whole street is moving towards serious homeowners. I can't imagine anyone would want to keep rental properties in such a prestigious area when they could sell to families who really care about the community." She gestured around the beautifully appointed room as if to illustrate her point about people who truly belonged in such a setting. The irony of her comments wasn't lost on me. She was celebrating her ownership of a house I had sold to her while simultaneously dismissing the rental properties that provided the foundation for the neighborhood's character and stability. I excused myself from the conversation I'd been having with one of Tyler's coworkers and stepped out onto the back patio for some fresh air. The evening was crisp and clear, with the kind of mountain air that usually helped me think more clearly. But tonight, it only emphasized how surreal the entire situation had become. More significantly, Allison was making sweeping assumptions about property ownership and community values that demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of how the local real estate market actually worked. The party concluded with Allison thanking everyone for helping them celebrate their new beginning. She made a particular point of acknowledging her father's generosity in making their dream possible, and she expressed hope that their new home would be the foundation for the kind of life she and Tyler had always envisioned together. Thomas and I were thanked for our support, but it was clearly an afterthought, a polite acknowledgement of our peripheral role in their success story. During the drive home, Thomas was enthusiastic about the party and genuinely proud of how well Tyler and Allison were settling into their new life. He pointed out how happy Tyler seemed, how impressed the guests had been with their beautiful home, and how wonderful it was to see our son achieving such success at a relatively young age. I nodded and made appropriate responses, but privately I was reflecting on the evening's revelations about Allison's attitude toward rental properties, community ownership, and the people she considered worthy of respect. Over the following months, this attitude became more pronounced and problematic. Allison began attending neighborhood association meetings and quickly established herself as an advocate for policies that would discourage rental properties and prioritize homeowners' interests exclusively. She pushed for stricter maintenance standards, higher fees for non-owner-occupied properties, and zoning changes that would make it more difficult to operate rental units in the area. Her efforts were well-intentioned from her perspective, but they demonstrated a complete misunderstanding of the neighborhood's economic dynamics. Willowbrook Lane's stability and property values were supported by a careful balance of owner-occupied homes and well-maintained rental properties. The rental income allowed property owners like me to invest in maintenance and improvements that benefited the entire community, while providing housing options for young professionals, graduate students, and families who weren't ready to purchase homes. Allison's campaign against rental properties was gaining support from some newer residents who shared her vision of an exclusively owner-occupied neighborhood. She organized petition drives, lobbied the city council, and even started a blog called Preserving Willowbrook, where she documented what she called the rental problem in prestigious neighborhoods. Her writing was passionate and persuasive, but it was based on assumptions and stereotypes rather than actual knowledge of local property ownership patterns or community needs. The situation became deeply personal during Thanksgiving 2021, when Allison used our family dinner as an opportunity to discuss her neighborhood activism with great enthusiasm. She was particularly excited about a recent victory in getting the city to increase licensing fees for rental properties, and she spoke passionately about her plans to clean up Willowbrook Lane by encouraging more families to purchase rather than rent. "It's really about community stability and long-term investment," she explained to Thomas while passing the sweet potatoes, her voice taking on the tone of a practiced public speaker. "When people own their homes, they care more about maintaining them properly and being good neighbors. Renters just don't have the same investment in keeping up standards or contributing to community improvement." She looked directly at me while making this point, as if expecting agreement or perhaps acknowledgement that our family's modest circumstances made us natural allies in her fight against transient residents. The condescension in her tone was unmistakable, and I felt my patience beginning to fray after months of listening to her disparaging people exactly like me. I asked what she actually knew about the property owners in her neighborhood, genuinely curious whether she'd done any research into who was making the rental decisions she opposed so vehemently.
Allison admitted she didn't know most of the landlords personally, but she'd heard from other homeowners that many of them were absentee owners who don't live locally and therefore didn't understand or care about the community's needs and values. That's exactly the problem with rental properties, she continued, warming to her favorite topic. The people making money from them don't have to live with the consequences of their decisions. They just collect rent checks from a distance without caring about how their properties affect neighborhood character, property values, or community cohesion.
Her tone suggested that such people were fundamentally different from responsible homeowners like herself, people who understood the importance of community standards, long-term investment, and maintaining the kind of environment where the right families would want to live and raise their children. Thomas nodded along with Allison's reasoning, and even Tyler seemed convinced by her arguments about community stability and property values. I found myself in the increasingly uncomfortable position of listening to my daughter-in-law advocate for policies that would directly impact my business and financial well-being, while simultaneously criticizing people exactly like me for their supposedly irresponsible approach to property ownership and community engagement. After dinner, while Allison and Tyler were showing Thomas some renovation plans for their kitchen expansion, I stepped outside onto our back porch and called my property manager. I instructed him to begin preparing comprehensive reports on all my Willowbrook Lane properties, including maintenance records, tenant satisfaction surveys, and detailed documentation of our contributions to local community development projects. If Allison wanted to wage war against rental properties in my neighborhood, she was going to discover exactly who she was fighting and what the real facts were about property management in her precious community. The confrontation I'd been anticipating finally came in February 2022. Tyler called on a Tuesday afternoon, sounding stressed and embarrassed. Quentin Green's furniture business had experienced some serious financial setbacks due to supply chain problems and increased competition from online retailers. They were going to need help making their mortgage payments until he could stabilize his business situation. The down payment assistance Quentin had provided had been structured as a family loan, and he was now calling it in to address his own cash flow crisis. "We're not asking for charity, Mom," Tyler said quickly, his voice tight with anxiety. "We just need a bridge loan, maybe $25,000, just until we can refinance or Dad Green gets back on his feet." He sounded mortified to be asking for money, clearly struggling with the blow to his pride that came with admitting they couldn't handle their financial obligations independently. I asked how long they thought they'd need assistance, and Tyler admitted he wasn't sure. Quentin's problems were more serious than they'd initially understood, and it might be several months before he could honor his original commitment to help with their housing expenses. In the meantime, their mortgage payment was consuming more than 60% of Tyler's salary, and Allison's real estate commissions weren't consistent enough to cover the shortfall reliably. They had already cut back on other expenses as much as possible, but the basic costs of maintaining their lifestyle in the expensive house were simply beyond their current means. When I suggested they might need to consider selling the house and finding something more affordable, Tyler was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Allison doesn't think that's necessary. She believes we just need to get through this rough patch and everything will work out fine." The way he said it suggested this was definitely Allison's position, not necessarily his own assessment of their financial situation. I told Tyler I'd need to discuss it with Thomas and we'd get back to him within a few days. That evening, Thomas and I had another difficult conversation about how much help we should provide and what we could reasonably afford without jeopardizing our own financial security. Thomas was inclined to give them whatever they needed, arguing that family should support family during difficult times and that we'd been blessed with enough resources to help our son through a temporary crisis. I agreed with the principle but questioned whether we were actually helping Tyler by enabling Allison's unrealistic expectations about their lifestyle and spending. The conversation was complicated by the fact that I still hadn't told Thomas about the full extent of our real estate holdings. He knew I owned several rental properties, but he assumed they were modest investments that provided supplemental income rather than the substantial portfolio they actually represented. Explaining why I was hesitant to provide $25,000, which Thomas saw as a significant but manageable expense, would require revelations I wasn't prepared to make. We eventually agreed to offer Tyler a formal loan rather than a gift, with reasonable terms and a clear repayment schedule that would protect our own interests while helping them through their immediate crisis. When I called Tyler back to explain our decision, he was grateful but seemed concerned about how Allison would react to the loan structure. She was kind of hoping for something more like what her dad provided, he said carefully, clearly trying to navigate between his wife's expectations and his parents' conditions. You know, more flexible terms, more of a family arrangement. I explained that Thomas and I needed to protect our own financial stability and that a formal loan was the most responsible approach for everyone involved. Tyler accepted this reasoning, but I could tell he was dreading the conversation with Allison about our conditions and limitations. The loan papers were signed in our kitchen on a cold Saturday morning in March 2022. Allison was polite but clearly disappointed with the arrangement, and she made several pointed comments about how different families had different approaches to supporting their children's success. She signed the documents with obvious reluctance, and I could see her mentally calculating how quickly they could pay off the debt and free themselves from any obligation to Thomas and me. "This is really generous of you both," she said with forced enthusiasm that didn't reach her eyes. "I know $25,000 is probably a lot for people in your situation." The comment was ostensibly grateful, but it carried an unmistakable undertone suggesting that our family's financial limitations made even this modest assistance a significant sacrifice that we could barely afford. I simply smiled and said, "We're happy to help Tyler during a difficult time." Over the next few months, the monthly loan payments became a source of increasing tension in our family dynamic. Allison clearly resented the regular reminder of their dependence on Thomas and me, and she began making comments about how the debt was preventing them from making necessary improvements to their home. She spoke often about how much better their financial situation would be once her father recovered and they could pay us back, eliminating what she obviously viewed as an uncomfortable obligation. The situation deteriorated further when Allison's neighborhood activism began affecting Tyler's work at the county assessor's office. As part of her campaign against rental properties, she had been filing formal complaints and requesting property inspections that required processing by Tyler's department. His colleagues began making jokes about his wife's crusade against landlords, and his supervisor mentioned that the increased paperwork was becoming a burden on their office's resources. Marcus found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to process his wife's complaints against property owners while trying to maintain professional neutrality and objectivity. When I asked him how he felt about Allison's activism, he said he supported her goals but wished she would work through different channels that wouldn't create conflicts of interest in his workplace. It was clear that Tyler was beginning to understand the broader implications of Allison's campaign, even if he wasn't ready to openly oppose her efforts or question her methods. The breaking point came in June 2022, when Allison decided to escalate her campaign by organizing a public meeting about what she called the rental crisis in prestigious neighborhoods. She had invited city council members, local real estate professionals, and affected homeowners to discuss policy solutions and coordinate community action. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening at the community center, and Allison had been promoting it through social media and neighborhood flyers for weeks. She was treating this meeting as the culmination of months of research and advocacy, her opportunity to present her case to a broader audience and gain official support for the policy changes she had been proposing. I decided to attend the meeting as a concerned resident, sitting quietly in the back row and listening as Allison presented her findings and recommendations to the assembled crowd. Her presentation was indeed impressive and well organized. She had prepared detailed charts and graphs about property values, community stability, and what she characterized as the negative impacts of rental properties on neighborhood character. Her arguments were passionate and articulate, and several attendees expressed strong support for her proposed solutions. During the question and answer period, a woman I didn't recognize asked about the actual property owners in the affected neighborhood. She wanted to know whether Allison had spoken with any landlords about their perspective on the issues she was raising, and whether there might be opportunities for dialogue and collaboration rather than adversarial policy changes. Allison admitted she hadn't contacted property owners directly, explaining that she preferred to work through official channels rather than trying to negotiate with people whose interests were fundamentally opposed to community welfare. Besides, she added with obvious conviction, Most of these properties are owned by people who don't live here and don't understand our community. They're just collecting rent checks without caring about the impact on families who are trying to build something permanent and meaningful." The audience nodded sympathetically, and several people shared their own stories about problematic rental properties and absent landlords who seemed indifferent to community concerns. I raised my hand during the final questions and asked whether Allison had considered the possibility that some local property owners might be responsive to community concerns if they were approached respectfully and given an opportunity for dialogue. I suggested that constructive conversation might be more effective than adversarial policies, and that property owners who lived in the area might have different perspectives and motivations than absentee landlords. Allison's response was polite but dismissive. "I appreciate that perspective," she said with the practiced patience of someone addressing a naive question, "but our experience has been that property owners are primarily motivated by profit rather than community welfare. We need policies that protect homeowners' interests, regardless of whether landlords choose to cooperate voluntarily." Her tone suggested that anyone who advocated for property owners' perspectives was either hopelessly naive or had ulterior motives that conflicted with genuine community interests. After the meeting, I approached Allison to congratulate her on a well-organized presentation. She was surrounded by supporters and clearly energized by the positive response to her proposals. When I mentioned that I lived in the area and was interested in her research, she launched into an enthusiastic explanation of her plans for the next phase of her campaign. "We're going to start documenting every violation and complaint involving rental properties," she said excitedly, her eyes bright with the fervor of someone who believed she'd identified a clear problem with an obvious solution. "Then we'll present comprehensive evidence to the city council and demand immediate action. These landlords think they can ignore community standards because nobody's been paying attention, but that's about to change dramatically." She spoke with the absolute confidence of someone who had never encountered serious opposition to her plans, someone who viewed the world in terms of clear heroes and villains, with herself obviously on the righteous side. I asked whether she'd had any direct communication with property owners about her concerns, and Allison shook her head with obvious puzzlement. "Why would I waste time talking to people who have already shown they don't care about our community? Their actions speak louder than any promises they might make to avoid accountability." She seemed genuinely confused by the suggestion that property owners might be reasonable people who could be engaged in constructive dialogue about legitimate community concerns. That conversation confirmed my growing certainty that Allison viewed the situation in stark, uncompromising terms, with responsible homeowners on one side and irresponsible landlords on the other. She had constructed a narrative that cast herself as a community advocate fighting against faceless property owners who threatened everything she valued about her neighborhood and social position. The possibility that some of those property owners might be neighbors, friends, or even family members had never occurred to her and wouldn't have mattered if it had. Over the next few weeks, Allison's campaign gained significant momentum and media attention. The Cedar Falls Tribune wrote a sympathetic article about her efforts to preserve neighborhood character, and she was invited to speak at a regional conference about housing policy and community development. She was becoming a recognized voice on rental property issues, and her confidence in her position was growing stronger with each public appearance and supportive response. The irony of the situation was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Allison was building her reputation as an advocate for homeowners' rights while living in a house she had purchased from me, making loan payments to fund a lifestyle she couldn't actually afford, and campaigning against the rental properties that provided the financial foundation for her new neighborhood's stability and character. Most significantly, she was attacking the integrity and community commitment of people she had never met, while taking for granted the support and generosity of family members whose resources and motivations she completely misunderstood. Most significantly, she was attacking the integrity and community commitment of people she had never met, while taking for granted the support and generosity of family members whose resources and motivations she completely misunderstood. I realized that the time for passive observation was rapidly ending. Allison's campaign was gaining enough momentum to actually affect local policy, and her public statements about property owners were becoming increasingly inflammatory and personal. If she wanted to declare war on rental properties in my neighborhood, she was going to learn exactly who she was fighting and what the consequences of that fight might be. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal not only the extent of my property holdings, but also the fundamental assumptions Allison had made about power, community, and family relationships. She had spent months positioning herself as David fighting against Goliath, but she was about to discover that sometimes Goliath has been standing quietly in the background, waiting patiently for the right moment to step into the light and set the record straight. The breaking point arrived on a humid Thursday evening in August 2022, when Allison knocked on our front door with a manila folder under her arm and an expression that could only be described as triumphant anticipation. She had been working on what she called Phase 2 of her rental property campaign, which involved creating detailed profiles of what she termed problematic landlords in the Willowbrook area. Thomas and I invited her in for iced tea, expecting another update on her neighborhood activism, but what she presented that evening went far beyond anything she had shared before. "I've been doing some serious investigative work," Allison announced, settling into our living room with the confidence of someone who believed she had uncovered something truly significant. "And I've discovered that one property owner is responsible for most of the rental problems in our neighborhood." She opened her folder and spread out what appeared to be property records, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes across our coffee table. According to Allison's research, someone with the business name E. Roberts Properties owned multiple houses on Willowbrook Lane, including several that had experienced what she characterized as rapid tenant turnover and maintenance issues over the past few years. She had compiled a comprehensive list of complaints filed against these properties, along with photographs of what she considered minor violations, like delayed landscaping maintenance and exterior paint touch-ups that hadn't been completed immediately. Most concerning to her was the fact that this property owner maintained complete anonymity, conducting all business through a property management company and business address rather than providing personal contact information. "The worst part," Allison continued, clearly energized by her detective work, "is that this person doesn't even live in our neighborhood. They're probably some out-of-state investor who sees our community as nothing more than a source of passive income." She pointed to the property records, which listed my business address rather than my home address as the owner contact information. Thomas leaned forward to examine the documents, and I could see him trying to process what Allison was showing us, though he hadn't yet made the connection between E. Roberts Properties and his wife Elvira Roberts. Her research was thorough but incomplete, and her conclusions about my motivations and character were based entirely on assumptions rather than facts. Most of the violations she had documented were minor issues that had already been addressed through routine maintenance procedures, but she had clearly spent considerable time building her case against this mysterious landlord. "What exactly are you planning to do with this information?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral while studying the photographs she had taken of my properties. Most of the problems she had documented were seasonal issues or temporary situations that had been resolved quickly, but she had clearly captured them at their worst moments to create the most damaging impression possible. Allison's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "I'm going to expose them," she said simply. "I'm organizing a comprehensive public campaign to put pressure on E. Roberts Properties to either dramatically improve their management practices or sell their properties to families who will actually care about our neighborhood." She explained that she had already contacted local media outlets and was planning to present her findings at the next city council meeting. "People have a right to know who's making money off our community while contributing nothing to its stability," she declared. "This E. Roberts person thinks they can hide behind business addresses and property management companies, but I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly how their greed and neglect are affecting our quality of life." I asked whether she had tried contacting the property owner directly to discuss her concerns before launching a public campaign. Allison shook her head dismissively. "Why would I waste time trying to reason with someone who has already shown they don't care about our community? Besides, people like this only respond to public pressure and negative publicity. Thomas was studying the property records more carefully now, and I could see recognition beginning to dawn in his expression. The business address Allison had identified was the same one I used for my property management company, and the initials E. Roberts clearly referred to Elvira Roberts. He looked at me with confusion and growing understanding, but said nothing while Allison continued her presentation. The really infuriating part, Allison went on, is that this person probably makes more money from these properties than Tyler and I earn combined, but they can't be bothered to maintain them properly or screen tenants carefully. She showed us a photograph of some peeling paint on a back fence taken from the alley behind one of the houses. Tyler works hard every day at a real job that contributes to our community, she said, her voice rising with indignation, while people like E. Roberts just collect rent checks while our neighborhood deteriorates around their neglected properties. The irony of her statement wasn't lost on me, considering that Tyler's real job, processing property assessments, was partially funded by the taxes I paid on those same properties. I excused myself to get more iced tea, needing a moment to process what I had just heard and decide how to respond. In the kitchen, I could hear Allison explaining to Thomas how she planned to organize a neighborhood boycott of businesses that worked with problem landlords. She had apparently researched the property management company I used and was planning to target them as collaborators in what she called the exploitation of our community. When I returned to the living room, Thomas was asking Allison whether she thought it was fair to attack someone without giving them a chance to respond to her accusations. His question was careful and diplomatic, but I could see he was struggling with the knowledge that his daughter-in-law was unknowingly declaring war on his wife. "Sometimes you have to fight fire with fire," Allison replied firmly. "These investors count on people being too polite or too intimidated to call them out publicly. Well, I'm not going to be polite anymore when it comes to protecting our neighborhood and our property values." She gathered her documents with the satisfaction of someone who believed she had recruited powerful allies for her cause. After Allison left that evening, Thomas and I sat in our living room staring at each other in stunned silence. Finally, Thomas spoke. "Ellie, those are your properties she's talking about, aren't they?" His voice was quiet, but I could hear the confusion and concern beneath his calm tone. I nodded, feeling the weight of years of maintained secrecy settling between us like a heavy curtain. "Yes, they are, and there are actually 2 more she hasn't identified yet." Thomas absorbed this information without immediately responding, and I could see him recalculating everything he thought he knew about our financial situation and my business activities. "How long have you owned them?" he asked finally. I explained that I had inherited 2 of the properties from my grandmother and had purchased the others over the years as they became available. The rental income had been substantial enough to allow us to live comfortably while maintaining the modest lifestyle we both preferred, but I had kept the full extent of my holdings private to protect our family's peace and privacy. Thomas was quiet for several minutes, processing not only the revelation about my property portfolio, but also the implications of Allison's campaign against me. "She's going to be humiliated when she finds out," he said eventually, "and Tyler is going to be caught in the middle of something he doesn't understand." I agreed that the situation was becoming untenable, but I wasn't sure how to address it without causing even more family drama. Allison had invested considerable time and energy in building her case against the mysterious E. Roberts, and discovering that her target was actually her mother-in-law would undermine everything she had worked toward.
Maybe you should just tell her, Thomas suggested. Sit her down, explain the situation, and give her a chance to adjust her approach before she makes this public. His optimism about Allison's potential reasonableness was touching, but I wasn't convinced she would be willing to abandon her crusade simply because it was inconvenient for family relationships. Over the next few days, I considered various approaches to resolving the situation. I could reveal my identity as the property owner and deal with the immediate fallout, or I could continue maintaining my anonymity and let Allison proceed with her campaign.
Neither option seemed likely to preserve family harmony, but I was increasingly convinced that silence was no longer sustainable. The decision was made for me when Tyler called on Sunday afternoon, sounding stressed and confused. "Mom, Allison's been showing me some research she's done about rental properties in our neighborhood, and some of the details seem familiar." He paused, and I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "The business address she found for one of the property owners is the same one you use for your bookkeeping clients." I asked what Allison had told him about her research, and Tyler explained that she had been working late every night for the past week, preparing what she called the most important presentation of her life. She had apparently scheduled meetings with 3 city council members and had been promised coverage by the local newspaper for her upcoming exposé of neighborhood slumlords. "She keeps talking about this E. Roberts person like there's some kind of criminal," Tyler continued, his voice growing more strained. "But Mom, E. Roberts isn't you, is it?" The question hung in the air between us, and I could hear that he already suspected the answer. I confirmed that I was indeed the E. Roberts whose properties Allison had been investigating, and I explained briefly about the inheritance from my grandmother and the investments I had made over the years. Tyler was quiet for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was filled with genuine distress. "Oh God, Mom, she's planning to destroy you publicly. She's got photographs, complaint records, everything. She thinks she's going to be some kind of hero for exposing you." He sounded genuinely horrified, caught between loyalty to his wife and the realization of what she was unknowingly planning to do to his mother. I asked Tyler what he thought we should do, and he admitted he didn't know. Allison had been so passionate about her research that he had been afraid to question her conclusions or methods. He had assumed she knew what she was doing and that her targets deserved whatever public scrutiny they received. "I can't let her humiliate you like this," Tyler said finally, "but I don't know how to stop her without admitting that I knew who E. Roberts was and didn't warn her." The complexity of his position wasn't lost on me. He was facing the choice between protecting his mother and supporting his wife's crusade, with no option that wouldn't damage one of those relationships. We agreed that I would need to reveal my identity to Allison before her planned presentation, but we disagreed about how and when that conversation should happen. Tyler wanted to tell her himself, believing that the news would be easier for her to accept coming from him. I preferred to handle the conversation directly, feeling that Allison deserved to hear the truth from the person she had been attacking. Our discussion was interrupted when Tyler received a text message from Allison asking him to come home immediately. She had apparently received confirmation that the city council would give her 15 minutes during their Thursday meeting to present her findings about problem landlords. She was excited and wanted to practice her presentation with Tyler as her audience. "I have to go," Tyler said reluctantly. "But Mom, please don't do anything until we can figure out the best way to handle this." I promised to wait, but privately I was beginning to think that allowing Allison to continue her preparations would only make the eventual revelation more painful for everyone involved. That evening, while Thomas worked in his shop, I sat at my kitchen table reviewing the documents Allison had shown us. Her research was impressively thorough, even if her conclusions were based on incomplete information. She had identified genuine maintenance issues that needed attention, documented legitimate tenant concerns, and compiled a persuasive case for increased oversight of rental properties. The problem wasn't that Allison was entirely wrong about everything. Some of her criticisms were valid, and her passion for community improvement was admirable. The problem was that she had approached the situation as a crusade against faceless enemies rather than as an opportunity for constructive dialogue with community stakeholders. I found myself wondering whether Allison's attitude would have been different if she had known from the beginning that one of the neighborhood's largest property owners was someone she knew personally. Would she have been more inclined toward collaboration if she had understood that her success in improving rental properties could benefit her own family? Or would she have seen my property ownership as a betrayal of trust and confirmation that people couldn't be relied upon to prioritize community welfare over personal profit? The next morning, I drove through Willowbrook Lane, looking at my properties through Allison's eyes and trying to understand her perspective. The houses looked peaceful and well-maintained, with no obvious signs of the problems Allison had documented in her research. My tenants were going about their normal activities, contributing to the neighborhood's character and stability just like the homeowners around them. I stopped at the property where Allison had photographed the peeling fence paint and examined the issue firsthand. The fence had been repaired weeks ago, but she had captured the problem at its worst moment, before the scheduled maintenance was completed. A call to my property manager confirmed that most of Allison's documented violations followed a similar pattern. Minor issues that were being addressed through normal procedures, but photographed and reported as evidence of systematic neglect. Her documentation showed problems at their worst moments, before repairs were completed, creating an impression of irresponsible management that didn't reflect the actual condition or care of the properties. I realized that Allison's campaign wasn't really about property maintenance or tenant satisfaction. It was about control and community identity. She wanted to live in a neighborhood where people like her made decisions about what was acceptable and who belonged. Rental properties represented unpredictability and lack of control, regardless of how well they were maintained or managed. That afternoon, I called my attorney, Margaret Sullivan, who had handled my property acquisitions for over 20 years. Margaret was known for her sharp mind and direct approach to problem solving. When I explained the situation with Allison's campaign and her planned public presentation, Margaret's response was immediate and clear. "Ellie, you need to document everything she's doing and prepare to defend yourself properly," Margaret said. "If she's planning to make false or misleading statements in a public forum, you have legal options." Within 2 days, Margaret had obtained copies of all official correspondence between Allison and various city departments under public records laws. The documents revealed a pattern of complaints and requests that went far beyond the maintenance issues Allison had presented to us. She had filed noise complaints about my properties that couldn't be substantiated, requested inspections based on anonymous reports that appeared to have been filed by her, and suggested zoning violations that didn't actually exist. Most significantly, Allison had provided city officials with her own interpretations of rental property regulations, suggesting violations and problems that weren't supported by actual legal standards. Her communications showed a clear pattern of attempting to create official problems for my properties through persistent and often baseless complaints. "This is harassment," Margaret said after reviewing the documentation. "She's been using government agencies as weapons against you, filing complaints she knows are frivolous to create the appearance of legitimate problems." The evidence was more damaging to Allison's credibility than I had expected, revealing a level of calculation and manipulation that went beyond mere community activism. Armed with this comprehensive evidence, Margaret and I scheduled a meeting with the City Council to present our findings and request that they reconsider their approach to Allison's proposals. The meeting was scheduled for the day before Allison's planned presentation, giving us the opportunity to provide complete and accurate information before she could mislead the council with her selective documentation. The City Council meeting was more crowded than usual when I arrived 15 minutes early. Word had spread about the rental property discussion, and curious neighbors filled most of the available seats. I recognized several faces from Willowbrook Lane, including 2 of my current tenants who had no idea they were about to witness their landlord being vindicated. When Margaret and I were called to present our evidence, the council members listened carefully as we methodically addressed each of Allison's accusations with documentation and context. We showed maintenance records proving proactive property care, tenant satisfaction surveys demonstrating positive experiences, and evidence of Allison's pattern of filing false complaints to create the appearance of problems. Council member Patricia Hoffman reviewed our comprehensive documentation with obvious concern. "This paints a very different picture from what Ms. Green has been presenting," she said finally. "If this evidence is accurate, it appears her campaign was based on deliberately misleading information rather than legitimate community concerns." The council voted unanimously to table any consideration of Allison's proposed rental property restrictions pending a full investigation into her complaints and methods. They also formally commended responsible property owners who exceeded municipal standards and contributed positively to neighborhood stability. When Allison arrived for her scheduled presentation the next evening, she was informed that her time had been canceled due to new information that required further review. The look of confusion and growing panic on her face as the council explained their decision was almost heartbreaking, but I felt no sympathy for someone who had deliberately tried to destroy my reputation through deception. Over the following days, word spread quickly through Cedar Falls about what had really happened. The local newspaper ran a follow-up story about the importance of thorough fact-checking in community advocacy, without naming Allison directly but making the lessons clear. Several neighbors who had supported her campaign quietly approached me to apologize and express appreciation for my actual contributions to the neighborhood. Tyler called 3 days later, his voice heavy with exhaustion and disappointment. "Mom, I'm so sorry for everything Allison put you through," he said. "I had no idea how calculating and dishonest she had been about the whole thing." He explained that when Allison learned the truth about my identity and the failure of her presentation, she had blamed him for not warning her and accused our entire family of deliberately humiliating her. Their arguments had escalated quickly, revealing fundamental differences in values and character that Tyler was finally beginning to understand. "She's been lying to me about so many things," Tyler continued. "Not just about you, but about her motivations, her methods, everything. I don't think I ever really knew who she was." Within 2 months, Tyler had filed for divorce and moved into one of my rental properties on Willowbrook Lane. Living as my tenant gave him a new perspective on the relationship between property owners and residents and helped him understand why my approach to property management had been so different from Allison's characterizations. The experience taught our family valuable lessons about communication, trust, and the importance of standing up for truth even when it's uncomfortable.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.